Okay, so today we have Keiko Nomura for our WiNS seminar speaker. Keiko is a marine social ecological systems scientist focused on fisheries sustainability and marine resource management. Her ocean-centered research has covered topics like marine spatial planning, small-scale fisheries adaptation, and conflict and cooperation in international fisheries. She combines quantitative network and spatial analyses with qualitative governance context to address key questions on ocean resource use. She did her PhD at Oregon State, and now, as a postdoctoral researcher at CU Boulder, she's now exploring how social ecological factors influence seafood trade in the Pacific, and in turn, how this supports food security and sustainable development in the region. Keiko, we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Please take it away.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the intro. I will share my screen again. All right, you guys seeing that? Cool. Okay. So yeah, as Haley mentioned, I'm a postdoc at CU Boulder, and today I'll just be sharing a bit of an overview of my work so far. Um, I'll do a really quick about me, although Haley just did that quite nicely. Um, My background is in environmental sciences and ecology, specifically marine ecology. I'm from Southern California, and so I got my bachelor's at San Diego State University. And then I had a little bit of a stint as an environmental educator, taking like kids on field trips and such. And I was famous on Yelp for a little bit. Then I moved to Oregon, where I got a master's in marine resource management. I studied small scale fisheries and thinking about how we can use network theoretic metrics as a measure of adaptation in small scale fisheries. And I stayed in that same lab and place to get my PhD in geography, which I finished up last summer. Since about September or October, I've been at the Environmental Data Science Innovation Inclusion Lab studying seafood trade, which I'll present on here today. And most of my work is ocean centric, though if I were to kind of boil it down to a few different words, these would be some of the words that I think about, and maybe some people watching right now also think about some of these words at the very least, probably the network part of things. And so I always like to start and end with pretty pictures of the ocean because why not? And I think generally my work boils down to this question: how do we interact with nature, and what are the implications for both people and nature in the way that people interact? So today's game plan, I'll give more of a topic-specific intro to fisheries, introduce the research questions and the initial results, and also the future directions. And although I have some experience studying the overlap between fisheries and network science, as I've worked into my PhD, now I'm studying food systems. So I'm trying to integrate these three different fields together, and I'll try to be explicit about when I'm borrowing ideas from which throughout today's talk. So the reason why the stuff I study is important, in my opinion, is that the ocean supports many ecosystem services. These are basically the benefits that people get from nature. And we can get jobs, food security, energy production, and just the intrinsic and cultural value of the ocean, which correlates to all these different sectors here at the bottom that are also related to the marine environment. I, spoiler, study fisheries in particular. And fisheries can range from small scale subsistence, artisanal fisheries, all the way up to larger scale commercial industrial fisheries and kind of everywhere in between. And when I say fisheries, I don't just mean like the fish in the ocean. You can think of it as the social, economic, political systems that are surrounding everything that goes into harvesting fish from the ocean. So here in the bottom right is an ecological network in blue and a social network up top, and that social ecological linkages are what are interesting in this system. And again, these fisheries provide millions of jobs worldwide, whether it's the actual harvesting or the processing and consumption, or they also provide a lot of different food security benefits. Around 12% of people's protein worldwide comes from fish. as well as the more intrinsic benefits that fisheries provide. And so I'll be focusing on the second part of things, food security. And when we bring in this food systems lens, food systems is basically the dynamic system that includes the production, processing, and distribution and consumption of food. And these can occur at all different scales and can be influenced by several different processes. Blue food in particular is the phrase that's been used lately to think about aquatic food systems, which are becoming increasingly important in people's diets worldwide. This plot here on the left is from the FAO, and it basically shows by country per capita seafood consumption is generally increasing in every continent across the world. And a large reason for this is because of the globalization of trade networks. This shouldn't necessarily get a ton of information from these networks here, except for the fact that between 1994 and 2012, they're growing. And more countries are getting involved in global seafood trade. And it's why any one of us can probably go to a grocery store and get tuna or shrimp or salmon, even though we might not live next to where they're caught. One difficulty in studying this, though, is that data is really sparse. Seafood traceability is a huge issue for sustainable food systems. And so addressing this data gap will be really helpful. And bringing in new analytical methods, particularly from network science, can be helpful for this. One side effect of these globalized trade networks, though, is that there's this inherent inequality that is occurring where higher income countries consume more seafood per capita. So on this chart, these two left bars show high income and upper middle income countries with pretty high seafood per capita intake compared to lower middle income countries, low income countries. And at the same time, low income countries tend to rely more on this protein source. So richer countries are able to diversify their diets a little bit more. Trade networks kind of perpetuate this inequality where shocks and economic factors can lead to nutrients flowing to these countries that are less vulnerable already. Presumably, this will have a lot of impacts on food security and health outcomes, especially since fish tend to be a really nutritious source of food. So for my project in particular, I study the Pacific Island countries. This map here kind of shows the study region. This is the Western Pacific Ocean. So for reference, here is Australia. And then there are several small Pacific Island countries that are shown here. And actually what's shown here are their national waters. These are often called blue states because they have a vast majority of their territory is actually ocean rather than land. And so they're highly reliant on aquatic foods and ocean fisheries as an industry. But at the same time, they're subject to this inequitable distribution of nutrients worldwide. So many of their fish catches are exported out, and there's a substitutability problem where sugary, processed, and other unhealthy foods are being imported at unprecedented rates, which may or may not be having an impact on the fact that these countries have some of the highest instances of heart rate, obesity, and other diet-related illnesses worldwide. And so this is the kind of study system that my postdoc research focuses on. There are 12 Pacific Island countries that I'll be referencing today, and I'll be calling them PICs for short. So the overarching research questions for not today, but for my entire postdoc really is basically exploring these networks. What do they look like? And this is what I'll be getting into more today, but also what's driving them? Why are they like that? What are some of the geopolitical, economic, and environmental factors that might affect how these networks are shaped? And then also, what are the outcomes of these in terms of hunger, health, and impacts on our environment? I also want to put this plug because I found this cool paper that was talked about FSNs, fishery supply networks. And a big part of it was that there are a lot of opportunities that have really yet to be realized. A lot of fisheries people don't necessarily get into networks as much as I think could be useful. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One is data availability is sparse. There's a severe lack of good relational data in fisheries that can be used to think about how we interact with the environment, how we interact with each other in terms of fisheries. And so improving the availability of that data will be really useful for things like looking at temporal networks and dynamical causal structures of why we interact with the environment the way that we do, which has these real policy insights. And fisheries are already inherently an interdisciplinary field with biologists, ecologists, sociologists, geographers. But I think that there's a lot of room to also talk to people like you and to borrow methods and things because I that we probably are thinking a lot about similar structures and processes. So I took the liberty of quoting myself here and that we should talk to you guys more. So part of the motivation for why I'm here also. All right, so getting into exactly what my research is, as I mentioned, there is a deficit of good trade data. However, Jessica Gephardt, who is a professor at UW, she has created this really cool database called the ARTIST database, Aquatic Resource Trade and Species, where she's essentially aggregated UN data, FAO data, various databases to get a clearer idea of fish trade. And rather than being more of a standard economic import-export trade database, this is particularly interesting aspect of this is that the trade network is constructed in terms of the source country or where the fish are caught, and then where it's exported to, and then where it's consumed. So there's sort of this trilateral trade structure that inherently emerges here and can let us look at how trade could evolve over time. I don't get into any temporal results here, but this data goes from 1996 to 2020. So a lot of opportunities to look at why it's shaped the way it is. I merged this database with essentially a nutrient composition database, which gives you, say, per gram of tuna, how much protein, iron, calcium, etc. is in that. And by converting these two together, we can essentially create a nutrient network, which is structured the same way as the trade network, where the nodes are countries, but instead the edges are nutrient quantities. So you can interpret the network in terms of how much nutrients are flowing from one country to another. This is normalized in terms of basically daily dietary intakes, which is RNIs. And you can see there's a lot of options for what value to assign to these edges and how to weight them. And I'll show how I essentially simplified that for the results I showed today in the next slide. So a couple things that I did to make this a bit simpler for our first pass at looking at the structure of the network is rather than looking at the trilateral trade from a source exporter to a consumer country, we've essentially aggregated them into a bilateral format. So you can see here at the middle, this is basically an edge list. So we can take a from to and a from to and kind of break up these edges. So we kind of lose the like a hyper edge sort of perspective on this trade. At the same time, rather than taking each individual nutrient content on the edges, we add them together to get what's called a nutrient density metric. This is often used in health and food systems studies as a way to simplify looking at how nutritious a given unit of something, in this case, a trade edge, could be. As I mentioned, this definitely is a choice, and it removes the trilateral flows and also the explicit roles that are in the network. But it lets us do some pretty standard global metric analyses on these networks as a first pass go. And I do this at two different geographic scales because I'm interested in looking at how the regional trade network might differ from the global trade network. So for the regional trade network, anytime a Pacific Island country is involved in one of these trilateral trade transactions, that data is pulled out to construct the regional network, whereas the global network is the entirety of the data that we get from the Aquatic Resource and Trade database. And we can use a variety of methods to kind of look at this. I kind of think about it in terms of these three different domains. One is just a pretty basic trade exploration. So what what are countries doing in the trade network? Are they a source, exporter, or consumer? What nutrients and species are being traded? And then from the health and food systems literature, we can look at net nutrient flows, which is essentially like a net strength metric of these nutrient flows in and out of nodes. We can look at the population, the percent of the population affected in each of these countries, and then consumption and production ratios. So how much of countries' fish that they're catching is being held on and consumed domestically versus exported out. On the network side of things, essentially just using a series of null networks today in this presentation to look at how statistically similar or different the regional versus the global trade networks are and what that might mean from a trade perspective. And then also looking specifically at the regional network to see if it's exactly what we might expect or if there's anything funky going on. So for initial results, let's start here on the left. This is essentially 3 histograms that are showing the amount of times different countries are showing up as a source country, an exporter country, and a consumer country. Here I've pulled out the countries that are in the PICs, so the Pacific Island countries that I'm looking at in particular that I'm intrigued about. At first glance, definitely can tell that these countries are more of sources rather than exporters. In fact, Fiji and PNG is Papua New Guinea. These are primarily the only Pacific Island countries that are used as dominant exporters. This is also probably because they have a lot of processing facilities on site and they're geographically close. So it logistically makes sense for them to be in that middleman position. And at the same time, these Pacific Island countries are pretty prominent consumers as well, which speaks to the fact that these fish are very important for their diets, but primarily they're high sources. This really, frankly, kind of hideous figure on the right now. I'll walk you through it a little bit, but this is a Sankey diagram and alluvial diagram, which again is structured in the same way. We have source, exporter, and consumer. And these different bars are showing continents and the proportion that continents occupy these role niches. One thing we can see pretty quickly is that PICs, again, show a huge proportion of occupy a huge proportion of the source niche. And they flow through the exporters and end up in the consumers where PICs are quite less. They occupy much less of the consumer position there. Something that I want to point out is this domestic PICs exporter node. And this indicates that Pacific Island country caught the fish and it stayed in that Pacific Island country until it was consumed. So that's what we would call domestic consumption and production. And from a network perspective, it might look something like this or a series of self loops if it was iterative, just to show that Pacific Island countries hold on to a lot of what they catch. And that will be a theme later on also. Another thing I want to point out is that most of the nutrients that are being sent are vitamin B12, protein, and fatty acids, all of which are really important for those non-communicable disease health outcomes I mentioned earlier. So on this figure, we have each of these panels is a Pacific Island country. On the y-axis, we have weight, and then each of these bars indicates where the trade and weight is coming from. And so we'll walk through it. The first bar, this red bar, indicates domestic consumption and production. So where I just indicated Fiji produces, Fiji exports, and then Fiji consumes. Every Pacific Island country has a pretty substantial amount of this domestic production, and it all contributes to the basically inflow, the in strength that we're seeing within these PICs. The next 2 bars, the green is essentially imports, and the blue is exports. And obviously green would be positive because it's an inflow, and blue for the exports would be negative as it's an outflow. All of these Pacific Island countries are participating in the global trade network, but mostly the imports are much greater than the exports, or vice versa. Most of the exports are much greater than the imports. So they're losing a lot more in the blue bar than they are gaining in the green bar. And then lastly, just summing all of these together gets the purple, which is that total overall net flow in or out of these countries. And most of these bars are purple, although notably a few of them are not. Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga tend to hold on to the fish that they catch, or they have a net positive inflow from the imports that are coming in. And so this is really useful just to kind of see how these nutrients or how the fish trade is flowing in and out, who's at a net loss, who's at a net gain. But it doesn't really tell us much from a nutrient perspective yet, and it doesn't quite tell us what the country-specific impacts might be. And so taking that same data, but converting it into those nutrient values that I mentioned. So we have calcium, fatty acids, iron, protein, vitamin A, B, and 12, and zinc. We can look at specifically how those are flowing between countries and also what the country specific impacts are. Because, say, Fiji gaining 500 grams of protein is much different for a population impact perspective than China gaining that same amount. It's just not going to feed as many people, but because Fiji is a much smaller country, it might. So we've calculated individual nutrient yields, which is again also used in the food systems literature, which is essentially daily dietary requirements per person per day. So one basically means that every person in that country is able to get their dietary fulfillments, their requirements of that nutrient. And a negative one indicates that that country has, there's been a net loss of the entire country's needs for that nutrient. One thing we can immediately see is vitamin B12 is just like off the charts. It's just magnitudes higher than a lot of these other nutrients. Tough to log scale because the one is quite meaningful here, but that's something I'm playing around with also. But again, you can see that Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga are really the only countries that have consistent net positive gains, and most of the other ones have losses. And just to kind of explain what some of this means for, let's take Kiribati for vitamin B12, it's about a negative 10. This means that trade is essentially contributing to a loss of 10 times their population's needs in vitamin B12. And we also have averages here as well, but the story is the same. Most of them are essentially losing many of their population's dietary needs. And so back to the domestic consumption and production, we can look at each Pacific Island country here as a bar, and this is a proportion of what they produce, so the fisheries that they harvest, how much of it is domestically consumed, which is indicated by the orange, and how much of it is exported for foreign consumption in the green. And there's a lot of variation between these countries, obviously, but on average, about 65% of what is caught in country is then exported for a foreign consumption. So aligning with that net loss and that source role that these countries often occupy. On the other end, where does the fish that is consumed come from? So this is the same structure, but instead this is the proportion of consumed food that is either domestically produced in the yellow or imported from foreign sources in the green. And in this case, on average, 73% of consumption is domestically produced. And so putting these two together, most of what PICs consume comes from their own countries. At the same time, most of what they harvest is actually sent outwards. And so there's a bit of this mismatch and could potentially point to some measures of vulnerability. So takeaways so far from the trade and the food metrics results is that PICs are sources that experience net losses of nutrients via trade, and that domestic consumption and production contributes substantially to this retention. So PICs are being self-sufficient in a way and also contributing a lot of nutrients to other countries worldwide. Now I'll move into more of the network sort of perspective on things. Here is going to be a pretty high level overview of just a comparison of the structure of the regional and the global trade networks. Both of these networks have the same nodes, which was kind of surprising. Both the global and the regional networks service the same number of countries, which speaks to the global reach of Pacific Island countries in terms of producing and exporting fish to the same size network as the global trade network. Pacific Island countries produce around 65 to 70% of the world's tuna supply, and so much of what we're looking at in this trade network is tuna sourced from these areas. But it's way less interconnected, many less edges, which is reflected in density. And you can also see different shapes by just glancing at the degree distributions, where a country in the global network has about 170 connections on average, whereas the Pacific Island country network is around 70 or so. And so taking these degree distributions, basically make several iterations of the network using a configuration model, a degree preserving model that relies on edge swapping to create of um, a bunch of replicates of a similar structure network and see how different or similar the regional and the global network might be. And so here are some results from this. We have different types of metrics and histograms showing the global in pink and the PICs in blue. And I'll just walk through a few of these in the next few slides, and then also try to translate what they might mean from a network perspective. So first, we see that PICs in the regional network has a much higher path length, or slightly higher path length. It's significant, so talk about it. They also have fewer mutual links in the reciprocity. Pacific Island countries is much, much lower than the global network, and the transitivity in the global network is also lower too. So there's that higher fragmentation in the regional network than the global, which when you think about it in a trade perspective means that there's a lot more trade steps that need to happen for nutrients to be distributed to Pacific Island countries compared to the global network because of its fragmentation, its longer path length. Diameter was not any significant here, but another thing is that the mutual links points to the fact that Pacific Island countries are exporting and they're not necessarily receiving any imports from those same nodes. So kind of aligning again with the net outflow that many of these countries are experiencing. PICs also show a slightly more community structure and a more significant modularity values from the MCMCs. And this probably points to sub-regional trade that is occurring within the Pacific Island countries. There's Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Many of these have trade partnerships with each other, slightly less within these groupings, although there's a lot of push to make Pacific Island countries as a whole sort of their own community in that sense, whereas global networks are kind of a hairball, if you can recall those two networks that I showed earlier. Everyone's trading with everyone with a little bit of an asterisk there, I would say. But there's a lot more connectivity than we're seeing than within the regional network. The last thing I'll point out between the regional and the global structures is the assortativity differences. The regional trade network shows slightly less of a hub and spoke structure, which is why I said asterisk on the last slide. Trade networks tend to have a bit of centralization around these large dominant exporters. Large countries, large GDPs, larger populations tend to have more trade and service other countries as well. But we're not seeing that pattern as strongly as we would expect in the regional network, likely due to an absence of large trade actors. This region is more dependent on exporting or on imports from other countries rather than being sort of a central node in that area. And so this was a comparison between those two scales, between regional and global networks, but doing the same configuration model methodology approach applied to just the regional trade structure. I want to see if what we get from the MCMCs in the histogram aligns or does not align with the empirical values from the trade data, which is these red dotted lines. And we see a lot of the same similar structures, higher sortativity, long path length, in this case, diameter is much higher than we would expect in some community structure as well. The main difference that we see is reciprocity comes out as being higher. I'll talk about that in a second. But these shared results can tell us that we are seeing what we might expect and what we were suspecting before. There's these inefficient trade pathways and a lack of dominant actors that are occurring in this relatively fragmented regional trade. We also would expect regional trade to be much higher than global trade for a variety of economic reasons like logistics, distance, and that sort of thing. We just don't quite see that here. And the higher reciprocity in this case might imply, again, more mutual trade links, but within the network, which maybe would align with that modularity result and that there are sub-regional sort of bilateral trade coming back and forth. So imports are responded with by exports. So we've seen these overall takeaways grayed out, these first three, but adding on top of that with the network structures we just talked about, the low reciprocity and clustering, high community structure, which could imply the fragmented pathways, could imply that Pacific Island countries could be considered economically vulnerable from a trade structural perspective using the network metrics, but also combining this with what we know from the food systems and the trade analysis that I showed earlier, kind of starts to point to this narrative of Pacific Island countries are sources that are not necessarily being reciprocated with, which makes sense from the literature with that substitutability problem I mentioned earlier. They're losing a lot of healthy food and importing much more unhealthy processed foods. Another step of this project that I won't mention the next slide, so I'll say now, is bringing in other types of trade. So agriculture, meat trade, sugary foods, and processed foods as well. And we would expect to see a net inflow of those and a net outflow of what we might consider healthy or things that have a high nutrient density, as I showed in the edge weights. So I'll go through some next steps. As I kind of alluded to earlier, I want to talk to network people more. So please let me know if there's anything that comes up here that I'm like clearly missing a cool method that could be used to look at these things. I know there are tons of ways to do things, but we want to look at why these networks are the way they are and what the outcomes of them might be. So I'm doing this in a couple ways right now to look at the causal mechanisms over the time series. With Harrison Hartelt at SFI, we're looking at constructing a gravity model, which is an economic trade model. Basically says that the larger the country and the closer the country, the more they'll trade together. Seeing how well that might apply to fisheries trade, and also seeing how well that might apply to the trilateral trade network structure. So not just between trade partners, but who's sending to which processor, and then where is that being consumed at. Also want to look at a variety of different metrics that might tell us, or models that might tell us more about the roles that countries are playing in this system. So playing with some SBMs over time, and then trying to relate these structural metrics to external data, like some that I have mentioned here. This is what I'm particularly interested in. This time series on the right shows a metric that's used in ocean science and ocean and climate science to look at El Nino. And it's essentially a measure of ocean temperature over time. And El Ninos, as you can see in this infographic on the left, very much affect Pacific Island regions, where the tuna and other fisheries will follow this warm blob of water. So depending on how El Nino is showing up in that year or not affects the spatial distribution of fisheries, which presumably affects production capacity and maybe has knock-on effects down into the network. Another example of things, oh, nice, the GIF worked. That's great. Some other things that I want to look at in terms of economic, geopolitical, and historical factors might be things like trade arrangements, subsidies, etc. Here's just a GIF of what the network looks like animated over time. And kind of a lot, but if you can see in 2003, 2004, 2005 down here, we point out that Papua New Guinea kind of comes online in 2005 and kind of stays more online than it was before throughout the rest of the time series. I suspect or I hypothesize that this is due to this export-driven development strategy that they signed to start in 2005, which basically created a bunch of partnerships for sending all types of things, including fish, to the EU, which are these yellow nodes in this network here. So by looking at things like this, things that facilitate trade, things that also might inhibit trade, like tariffs and other sorts of trade factors, could be a different way to look at the geopolitical and economic parts of the international landscape. And beyond looking at what causes these networks to be the way they are, what are the outcomes? And I'm particularly curious in linking this to sustainable development goals. There are two particularly relevant SDGs about zero hunger, good health, and well-being. And there's a wealth of data that's coming out in terms of metrics to measure these things. For instance, this plot shows prevalence of undernourishment by country in terms of percentages. And so taking these time series and relating it somehow to network structural measures that we're seeing could be useful in showing us how fisheries trade may or may not show up in the health outcomes that we're seeing on the ground. And so I want to use a variety of methods. Population attributable fractions comes from, I think it's an econometric tool, but basically how much of the population's outcomes can you attribute to a certain input, and this input being fisheries trade. And other simple panel regression / other network tools, question mark, I'm not sure yet, could be also useful here too. And just to wrap up, a lot of open-ended questions as I've been getting more into this trade, the data structure, and then also thinking more about what's actually being thought about in terms of fisheries trade literature. I'm looking into different ways to assess causality and meaningful breakpoints in the temporal data. Also thinking about how to more explicitly hold on to the source, exporter, consumer roles, and similarly explore the trilateral data structure, potentially with multi-layer networks or other types of things that might be more intuitive for the inherent way that this data was structured to begin with, because we did collapse it into bilateral networks, did remove some of the other information. So is there a way to go back to that native data structure and find other ways that might be useful to get at some of these bullet points are things that I'll be thinking about more in the future. And like I said, I like to end with a pretty ocean picture because why not? Again, thinking about these human natural interactions, because these blue foods are increasingly important, but data remains really scarce. So I'm really trying to leverage the heck out of this database, in case you couldn't notice, to try to give us some more information on this up and coming sort of problem in environmental science and food systems literature, which has a lot of policy implications on several different scales and on several different domains, whether it's fisheries management specifically, trade policy, food sovereignty in the Pacific Islands. There are many angles that this could go, and tons of different types of management and policy implications, and those that would be interested in that. And at the same time, this requires people from many different fields putting their heads together as globalization continues to bring elements of humans and nature and people and geographies together. We need to think about methods and perspectives from different places. And so that's why I'm here talking to you guys, to talk to a new audience about these things, and to continue to push on moving this forward. And I'll say thanks. Thanks to my collaborators also at Environmental Defense Fund, Cornell, and the Santa Fe Institute who are helping me with this project.
Thank you so much, Keiko. That was incredible. It was also a really phenomenal example of the power of multidisciplinary work. I was so impressed with how you wove through different fields so like fluidly. Um, so thank you so much. We have time for questions. I have one, but I'll give some of the audience members a couple of moments to collect their thoughts. Feel free to share them in the chat or unmute yourselves if you have questions.
Thanks, Haley.
Can you see the chat, Keiko, or would you like me to read off questions from the chat for you?
Oh, let's see. I don't know where it went.
I can read it off.
Oh, I got it.
You got it?
Yes. Can you please give links to the attention? Yes, I will do that. How did I build the temporal network data set? So the data comes in essentially an edge list format where it's the countries are the source, exporter, and consumer, species, and year, which are the most relevant ones, variables that I used. And so I just aggregated at the smallest time step that I could. So they're all annual time steps at um, that temporal resolution. One thing that I did do at the beginning is add all the weight of all of the species that were traded between those countries per year. And so there's definitely some other choices that could be made earlier on. I think about 70% of the trade that I looked at, maybe like 80% actually, was tuna. So most of it is pertaining to tuna, but there are a lot of other species that you could pull out earlier on um, to build different types of temporal networks to compare. I don't quite have code ready to share, but I'm happy to chat and also just send you my code too, along with the links to the data sets.
So I have a question about the your analyses of the regional networks. I was wondering if you had any guesses as to why Fiji and Samoa and Tonga stood out as having um, like different trade profiles than other Pacific Island countries, or what kind of data you might need to get at that question.
Yeah, I think Fiji is a bit more straightforward because Fiji has some processing facilities and it also did bring in trade agreements fairly early on with both the US and the EU, as well as large Asian countries that consume a lot of fish. I also suspect that the geographies will make a difference too. Um, Oftentimes, the fisheries, like the vessels that are actually catching these fish, are considered distant water fishing fleets. So they're these large fishing vessels that will stay out at sea for months at a time without coming back to their home country. What they can do in the meantime, though, is they can go and dock somewhere else, unload their fish, and then go back out to go fishing. And so I think that Fiji in particular is a good candidate geographically for fishing vessels to land, as they say, and go to port. And simply because of that, they might have more economic activity because from an economic perspective, fishing takes a lot of money in terms of fuel and time and labor. And if you can go refuel without going all the way back home, that's probably something you would want to do. So the data that I would want to look at for that would be fishing vessel locations. I use that a bit in my PhD, and a lot of that data is becoming a lot more high resolution, but you can track individual fishing vessels and see where they may or may not be ending up. And that would be my hypothesis for Fiji. For American Samoa, I suspect that it's because they have pretty prominent tuna canneries on that area. So tuna processing facilities. I think it's star-kissed actually. So star-kissed tuna, a lot of that is canned in American Samoa. Tonga, I have no idea. That's kind of a sleeper for me right now, but I'll loop back to you.
Thank you.
Nice. Thanks, Tim. And yeah, Vicky, email me or I'll get your email from Haley perhaps, and then I can share that with you.
I have another question, I guess, while people type things in the chat if they have things to say. What kinds, like, because you're pulling from so many different data sets and you're talking about international trade networks, I would imagine that there are a variety of different policy implications that your work has. How directly do you feel like you're able to make policy suggestions, or like to what extent do you and your collaborators engage with like new policy formation or making policy recommendations, things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Be hard to pick a lane, I think, when there's this much going on.
Mhm.
I think there are two things that come to mind, though. One is the distant water fishing fleets that I just mentioned to you. I'm part of a community of practice of people that are primarily in academia, but a lot of nonprofits and a lot of people that have direct communication links to policymakers as well. So people at Conservation International or WWF who are really interested in what are the effects of distant water fishing fleets worldwide. West Africa is an example that's often cited where large Chinese flagged fishing vessels will go in and fish and essentially take the fish and it doesn't actually return to West Africa. And so there's much more um, interest in moving that lens geographically to the Pacific as we're seeing migration of tuna out of Pacific Island countries' waters, as we're trying to sort of, in many cases, scale back the size of distant water fishing fleets in many countries. So thinking about the interaction between food security outcomes and distant water fishing fleets is an interesting intersection. And actually, the conference I'm going to that I mentioned earlier is a UN Ocean Science conference in June, and there will be people there that are discussing those sorts of crossovers. And it's still kind of, I would say, it's still kind of new. So, like, what does that actually mean? We've narrowed in a couple domains, but trying to get international cooperation in a setting like this is tough. The other thing I'll mention is so my advisor at Cornell, he is a Pacific Islander and has many connections to people in this region. My advisor, Jacob Burek at EDF, works in Kiribati specifically. And so, one thing that I would love to do with this is do sort of an iterative research process where I'm taking the data and I'm taking it to the people and saying, does this make sense with what you're seeing on a regional level? Those people are also making amazing progress in creating regional trade databases that may or may not align with the global perspectives on data, on trade data, which are aggregated with certain algorithms that maybe don't um, take into account certain dynamics all of the time. So, kind of trying to go back and forth for more regional food security implications and seeing where the regional databases and the global databases do or don't align, I think is really important for kind of making sure that this accurately gets talked about on like a global scale, which the global scale will be needed to try to address these things. The last thing you triggered me a little bit. The last thing I'll say is that I looked at 12 Pacific Island countries, no territories were in this data. Again, because of data quality, the way that data is aggregated at a global level. For instance, French Polynesia has a huge ocean area, but its trade data is aggregated to look like it comes from France. And so the territories and the sovereign countries that they're associated with are not separated in a way that is useful, I think. And so digging more into that and sort of the equity part of the data availability, I think could also help just communicate the issue to stakeholders.
Well, that was such a complicated and interesting answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have a couple more minutes in case anyone else has any questions. If not, we can part ways. But again, Keiko, that was a phenomenal talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, thanks, Haley.
Yeah.
Very excited.
Well, maybe if no one has anything to say, then we call it the end. All right. Thank you for attending, everyone. And thank you again, Keiko. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.